Chapter 1. Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov. Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov was the third son of a landowner from our district. Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, well known in his own day and still remembered among us because of his dark and tragic death, which happened exactly 13 years ago and which I shall speak of in its proper place. For the moment, I will only say of his landowner, as we used to call him, though for all his life he hardly ever lived on his estate. That he was a strange type, yet one rather frequently met with, precisely the type of man who is not only worthless and depraved, but muddle-headed as well. One of those muddle-headed people who still handle their own little business deals quite skillfully, if nothing else. Fyodor Pavlovich, for instance, started with next to nothing. He was a very small landowner. He ran around having dinner at other men's table. He tried to foist himself off as a sponger. And yet at his death he was discovered to have as much as 100,000 rubles in hard cash. At the same time he remained all his life one of the most muddle-headed madcaps in our districts. Again, I say it was not stupidity. Most of these madcaps are rather clever and shrewd, but precisely muddle-headedness, even a special national form of it. He was married twice and had 3 sons. The eldest, Dmitri Fyodorovich, by his first wife, and the other 2, Ivan and Alexei, by his second. Fyodor Pavlovich's first wife belonged to a rather wealthy aristocratic family, the Muzovs, also landowners in our district. Precisely how it happened that a girl with a dowry, a beautiful girl too, and moreover one of those pert, intelligent girls not uncommon in this generation, but sometimes also to be found in the last, could have married such a worthless runt as everyone used to call him. I cannot begin to explain, but then I once knew a young lady still of the last romantic generation who, after several years of enigmatic love for a certain gentleman, whom by the way she could have married quite easily at any moment, ended up after inventing all sort of insurmountable obstacles by throwing herself on a stormy night into a rather deep and swift river from a high bank, somewhat resembling a cliff, and perished there decidedly by her own caprice, only because she wanted to be like Shakespeare Ophelia. Even then, if the cliff chosen and cherished from long ago had not been so picturesque, if it had been merely a flat, prosaic bank, the suicide might not have taken place at all. This is a true fact, and one can assume that in our Russian life of the past 2 or 3 generations, there have been not a few similar facts. In the same way, the action of Adelaida Ivanovna Muzov was doubtless an echo of a foreign influence, the chaffings of a mind imprisoned. Perhaps she wanted to assert her feminine independence, to go against all social conventions, against the despotisms of her relatives and family, and her obliging imagination convinced her, if only briefly, that Fyodor Pavlovich, despite his dignity as a sponger, was still one of the boldest and most sarcastic spirit of that transitional epoch. Transitional to everything better, whereas he was simply an evil buffoon, and nothing more. The affair gained piquancy from elopement, which strongly appealed to Adelaida Ivanovna. As for Fyodor Pavlovich, his social position at time made him quite ready for any such venture, for he passionately desired to set himself up by whatever means. To squeeze into a good family and get dowry was tempting indeed. And for mutual love, it seems there never was any either on the bright spot or on his own. Despite the beauty of Adelaida Ivanovna, this was perhaps the only case its kind in Fyodor Pavlovich's life, for he was a great sensualist all his days, always ready to hang on to any skirt that merely beckoned to him. This one woman alone, sensually speaking, made no particular impression on him. They had no sooner eloped than it became clear to Adelaida Ivanovna that she felt only contempt for her husband and nothing more. Thus the consequences of their marriage revealed themselves extraordinarily quickly, and though her family even accepted the situation fairly soon and allocated the runaway bride her dowry, the marriage couple began leading a very disorderly life, full of eternal scenes. It was said that in the circumstances, the young wife showed far more dignity and high-mindedness than did Fyodor Pavlovich, who, as is now known, filched all her cash from her, as much as 25,000 rubles, the moment she got it, so that from then on, as far as she was concerned, all these thousand positively vanished, as it were into thin air. As for the little village and rather fine town house that come with her dowry, for a long time he tried very hard to have them transferred into his name by means of some appropriate deed, and he would probably have succeeded merely because of the contempt and loathing, so to speak, that his shameless extortion and entreaties aroused in his wife merely because of her emotional exhaustion. Anything to be rid of him. Fortunately, Adelaida Ivanova family intervened and put a stop to his hogging. It is well known that there were frequent fights between husband and wife, but according to tradition, it was not Fyodor Pavlovich who did the beating, but Adelaida Ivanova, a hot-tempered lady, bold, dark-skinned, impatient, and endowed with a remarkable physical strength. Finally, she fled the house and ran away from Fyodor Pavlovich with a destitute seminarian, leaving the 3-year-old Mitya in his father's hands. Fyodor Pavlovich immediately set up a regular harem in his house and gave himself to the most unbridled drinking. In the intermissions, he drove over most of the province, tearfully complaining to all and sundry that Adelaida had abandoned him, going into detail that any husband ought to have been too ashamed to rebel about his married life. The thing was that he seemed to enjoy and even feel flattered by playing the ludicrous role of the offended husband, embroidering on and embellishing the details of the offense. One would think you had been promoted. One would think you have been promoted, Fyodor Pavlovich, the scoffers used to say. You are so pleased despite all your woes. Many even added that he was glad to brush up his own old role as buffoon, and that, to make things funnier still, he pretended not to notice his ridiculous position. But who knows, perhaps he was simply naive. At least he managed to find the trail of his runaway wife. The poor woman turned out to be in Petersburg, where she had gone to live with his seminarian and where she had thrown herself wholeheartedly into the most complete emancipation. Fyodor Pavlovich at once began bustling about, making ready to go to Petersburg. Why? He of course had no idea. True, he might even have gone, but having undertaken such a decision, he at once felt fully entitled to get up his courage of the journey by throwing himself into more boundless drinking. Just then his wife's family received news of her death in Petersburg. She died somehow suddenly in some garret, of typhus according to one version, of starvation according to another. Fyodor Pavlovich was drunk when he learned of his wife's death, and the stories goes that he ran down the street, lifting his hand to the sky and joyfully shouting, "Now let us thou thy servant depart in peace." Others say that he wept and sobbed like a little child, so much so that they say he was pitiful to see, however repulsive they found him. Both versions may very well be true, that is, that he rejoiced at his release and wept for her who released him, all at the same time. In most cases, people, even wicked people, are far more naive and simple-hearted than one generally assumes, and so are we.